I did look up, but at the moment, I don't remember which session this is. I'll try to look that up for the next time. But instead of beginning with a review quiz, all of tonight is review. And so my intent is to start with the introductory material and hit highlights of everything that we covered up until we took our break. So everything through the first 3 vision sequences we'll cover tonight. So I intend to complete that. I have a schedule, if I can keep to it, which first and foremost, pace will be dictated by what we need. When we need to slow down, we will. But I think it's feasible that we will actually complete, because we've already done the most of the hard work, believe it or not. We've already learned the tools. We should complete before Thanksgiving. So that gives us just a little bit of cushion in case we don't. But that's the game plan. So, to begin tonight, I just thought I would read the opening again. Chapter 1, beginning verse 1. The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show to his servants the things that must soon take place. He made it known by sending his angel to his servant John, who bore witness to the word of God and to the testimony of Jesus Christ, even to all that he saw. Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear and who keep what is written in it, for the time is near. This is the opening to this great letter, to this great book, and so let us begin with our review. If you noticed, the handouts for tonight, you should have 3, and the contents of those handouts look very similar to what you already have. I was kind of in a quandary of if I should make handouts or just go over the old ones, but I figured we'll just have this concise one, and if you want to just look at your old notes as we go through, do that. If you want to fill in blanks as we go through the old ones, and if you find a page where you skipped a space and you want to ask about it, do that. Or if you just want to follow along with tonight's handouts, it'll be sort of a concise summary. So, for those of you who were not here for the very beginning, this was the first slide that I showed back then. There are 2 kinds of people when it comes to interpreting the Revelation: those who agree with me completely, and those who have not yet heard me explain it. I don't remember who said that, but if you recall, I said that was not my position on this book, and it still isn't. So, for those of you who have hung in, thank you. And we're not going that route anymore. All right, so we're going to have handouts just like before. We'll have, hopefully, question and answer time at the end of tonight and at the end of every session, just like before. Those questions that are about future texts, I will record so that we answer them when we get there, so that we don't get ahead of ourselves and create gaps to fill. We have so far 1 question, and it's for the very last section, so I'm holding that out. Brother Ray asked it. He's not here tonight. There will be quizzes as we go along the way, but those of you who've been here, those are not to embarrass anyone. We do it all together out loud. We'll continue to do that. I am recording the audio, and the video will be uploaded to YouTube with the slides and the audio. You have the handouts. I'll post those. So all that is just like before, just to remind you what we have at our disposal, or what you have at your disposal. Let's begin with lesson 1. There is only one revelation. I said that at the beginning. I say it again tonight for 2 reasons. 1, it's a small pet peeve. 99.9% of Christians everywhere call this the book of Revelations. I don't know why that started that way. So it's partially a pet peeve, and if you just want to be a bit of a smart aleck at your next party and someone says the Revelations, you say, well, actually, there's only one revelation. But there's actually a real reason why. Yes? She has already used it. See? I'm trying to give you the tools. All right. There is a real reason why I say this, though, beyond speaking accurately or sounding correct or whatever. The point is that for whatever reason, people started adding the S. People treat it as if there is an S. And what I mean by that is they forget that the whole book is one book. And so they'll treat this piece, and it doesn't have to coincide with another piece, and we don't have to harmonize these texts. And I say, no. There's one revelation. The opening, you just heard me read, chapter 1, verse 1, the revelation of Jesus Christ. The whole thing is one cohesive picture, made up of smaller pictures, but it's one picture. So it all has to go together. And if we can't put it together, then we haven't got it right. All right. My aim is to make this book accessible. It is true that there are many and broad variation of understandings, differences of opinion, of interpretation, even among good, solid Christians and good, solid churches. But my main aim is not to set the record straight. My main aim is that I think the bigger problem is that because there's such confusion that people shy away from it. And if I remember correctly, the first session I asked people for a show of hands who was intimidated by the book, and almost everybody just raised your hand and said, yeah, I know it's there, I don't read it, I don't discuss it, certainly don't debate it, right? And so hopefully through this, that sort of melts away. So I heard you say, looking over the handouts for tonight, you know some of the answers already. So maybe that's sinking in. And even where we're not going to just immediately agree, that's okay. I will give you time to think about that. But, in all seriousness, I want it to be, it's a book of our Bible, right? And I'll never get through this if I don't pick up the pace. So, canonicity and attestation. What do we mean by canonicity? Anybody remember the definition for that term?
Something that's actually in the Bible.
Yep. So on your handouts for tonight, we summarize that by saying, is it Bible? Attestation. Anybody remember that?
Oh,
No, she doesn't. Okay. Attestation is finding where it is recognized or confessed to be Bible. Now, I don't expect, although apparently Sister Brenda has already broken out at some function that there's only one revelation, I don't expect you at your next dinner party to say, let's discuss the attestation of the book of the Revelation. No. My point in addressing these topics is, if this is a part of our Bible, and we confess it is, then A, we should use it, we should read it, we should believe it, we should look for God's message in it, and B, we should treat it like it's part of the Bible. Part of the reason there are so many differences of opinion on the Revelation is that people want to say it's in a class by itself. We don't have to apply the same rules of hermeneutics or interpreting the Scripture. We can just treat it wholly different. It's unlike anything else. No. It's part of the Bible. It is theopneustos, God breathed. Right? So, if it is, and it is, then we should treat it as such. We should ask those important questions like, what kind of writing is it? How should we understand it? All those things that we got into, and we're going to get into some of it tonight. That's the reason I raised the question of canonicity and attestation. And just to summarize, it is Bible. And it was attested to very early on. Even though since that time it has become one of the most questioned books, it was accepted quickly early. All right, let's talk about authorship and dating. And I don't mean boys going out with girls. Who wrote the book? John. Which John? Right. Same one that wrote the Gospel of John. 1 John. 2 John. 3 John. When did he write it? Well, there's some question there. Anybody remember or able to read numbers on the screen to tell me what are the two proposed dates?
69 AD or 960.
Very good reading. All right, and again, those are not real dates. The point is, it either happened before 70 AD, which is why they say 69 to catch sort of everything before that, which means before the destruction of Israel, Or else it happened after, and since he died in the late 90s, they just made it easy and say either 69 or 96. Right? So early or late. Why is that important? Well, it's important to know that John wrote it because we see some of the phrasing that's very, as the commentators say, Johannine, meaning we find those same phrases used in the Gospel of John, 1 John, 2 John. And that's a big help to us understanding. Most of us use language pretty uniformly, unless you're in front of somebody you want to impress, and then you just speak completely differently. But John wasn't doing that. So that helps us interpret. Why are the dates important? Deciding between early and late may make some decisions in your interpretation. My main goal in pointing out the dates is back to, this is part of your Bible. There is no part of the New Testament that was written after the 1st century. Unbelieving quote-unquote scholars try to say, oh, these documents came about later. Sometimes they'll make such claims. No, this is part of what John the Beloved wrote. And so he wrote it in his lifetime. He wrote it early. He wrote it when he still had clear memory. Not to mention the fact that it was by the interpretation or inspiration of the Spirit. But it was written with the other New Testament documents in the 1st century. If I'm going too fast,
So early equals what?
69.
So which part do you, or which age do you think?
I lean early.
Kind of
I don't think it makes as big a difference as some people make it out to be if you want to go early or late. But I would lean early. Part of the reason is I think that he's preparing the early church for the 1st century persecution. Granted, there's more in the 2nd, but I think he was preparing them for what happened in the later part of the 1st century.
You would say, though, that when it was wrote, all the churches that are spoken of in the New Testament that Paul set up or whoever set up were set up at the time.
Yes.
Well, the reason I thought early was because there was so much unrest
Mm-hmm.
in the area at the time with the revolts,
Absolutely.
everything was going on, people getting arrested and so forth.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting when we talk about the providence of God and the spread of the gospel in the early church. You know, the Roman Empire was a mixed bag of pluses and minuses, as are most anything, right? Because we think Roman Empire, early Christianity, we think persecution, we think all these things. The truth of the matter is, you know, the Greeks came in and solidified the language and, by a large extent, the culture. Then the Romans came through and they instituted this Pax Romana, which you were supposed to trust Rome, which was a bad thing. But in so doing, they laid out roadways. They made it safe to travel between areas within the empire. They enabled, because it was of God's providence, the quick and rapid spread of the gospel. So, yeah, after you get past destruction of Jerusalem and past that, it gets some of that dicier. So, I lean early. Good question. All right. Let's talk about the approach to the interpretation. And I can't remember now, and I don't have one of the handouts in front of me, but I think I included on there that our approach to interpretation is not the same as our end times position. Is there something like that on there? There you go. Yes. In other words, we discussed there are 3 broad categories: premillennial, amillennial, postmillennial. That's something that we will discuss, especially when we get into the 20th chapter. We have discussed some already. This is not that question. There is the 4th category, I'm sorry. Panmillennial. Those are the people that just say it's all going to pan out. I don't know. Right. I heard that this week again. I thought I'd throw it out there. All right. So, why do I talk about this? How do we approach the interpretation of this book? Well, there are at least 5 major camps. The Roman or liturgical position, which says that the purpose for the book of the Revelation is it's a recorded mass. So we should structure our worship based upon the order of the revelation. Now, I don't hold to that, but there's some truth in that. We should see elements of worship. It should affect our worship, and we should recognize when we're talking about the book of Revelation, he's given these prophecies, and he's giving heavenly perspective on things. We should think about the heavenly perspective, and most of the time as Baptists, we kind of leave that out. It's one of our weaknesses, right? We don't think about the fact that when we come in on Sunday morning, during the holy hour, quote unquote, 11 o'clock, that is the holy hour, that's when God speaks, right? But all kidding aside, we begin at 11, but we're taking part in something that's been going on, right? Our worship is enjoined with those saints who are already there. So when we have, for instance, in the opening, the vision of the throne room of God, and we see the elders bowing down there, and this depiction that there is always worship going on in heaven, we're participating in that when we meet together as a church. And that's pretty awesome. But we don't take this position as how to interpret. There's much more going on here. There is the idealist or moralist position or approach, which says that the events and the characters described in these visions don't speak to any historical persons or events, but it's just meant to convey themes to us. Themes of justice, themes of perseverance, right? I reject this as a lens through which to read the Revelation. However, I do say it certainly addresses themes of persecution, of perseverance, etc. There is the futurist camp, which probably most of evangelical Christians in America today are in this, which says the Revelation is only all about future events. Right? Which is an interesting thing. You heard me read the opening of the book when it says the time is near. And that message reverberates throughout the book. John is writing by inspiration of the Spirit to prepare the church for what is about to happen. And so we say it was applicable in the first century and in every century since. So it's not merely futurist, although it certainly does point toward the conclusion of things. It does point us to the last day. It does talk about the last day, but not solely. So in response to that, there is the historicist approach, which most of the missionary Baptist peoples with whom we associate, most of them take a historicist approach, which is to say, the book is only about history for us. And I agree a lot with that. The problem is, most of the historicist readings say that John was writing about, prophesying about, very Western and European and American specific history. Right? I've never heard anyone go through the Revelation with a historicist approach that dealt with the East very much, except to say that's the great battle that's building. All the symbols seem to point out what happened in Europe in the Middle Ages and what's happening in America now. And so, no, this book addresses much more. This is applicable to churches worldwide. And the fifth is the preterist camp, which is similar to the historicist, but more specifically says that all the events described in the Revelation, or essentially all of them, completed before AD 70. So they require that early dating. Right? I'm closest to the preterist, but I took the term and I've taken some ribbing for using it, but it's not my term. I heard it used by a professor in a lecture series I listened to of eclectic, which says none of these purely are true. There's some good in all of them. I would be closest to the preterists, but not fully. So, it's not just about future, it's not just about past, and it's certainly not just about Europe and America. What about the literary genre? Who remembers, those of you who were here for the introductory studies, when we talked about literary genre? Do you remember any of the examples I used? Or could you read them for your notes? This is an open book, that's fair.
I remember you said apocalyptic, but I don't remember exactly.
That's okay. We understand that there are different kinds of literature, different kinds of messages, right? We talked about, for instance, if I remember correctly, a novel, a television commercial, and a science textbook, if I remember correctly, right? You need to read or listen to those very differently. The textbook is making truth claims in a very specific way. The television commercial for Folgers, if I remember, the best part of waking up is Folgers in your cup. Now, that is not at all the same kind of a truth claim that a science textbook is making when it discusses the distance of the earth to the sun. So we understand dealing with literature in different ways. We understand when we read a novel that while there may be historical facts or geographical facts that are accurate, that the story is fictional. So we understand that, and we just need to remember that within the Bible there are different genres. And so we shouldn't read the Psalms, which is poetry, which is song. We shouldn't read that the same way we read Genesis or the Gospels, right? Some of the language in the Psalms is poetic license. It's exaggerated. It's lyrical. It's beautiful. When one of the Gospel writers says, and they walked from one place to another, they actually mean they walked from that place to the other. So, the question is, how do we read the Revelation? And it is, by and large, apocalyptic prophecy. So here are some of the aspects of that. It's like reading dream sequences. They sort of come in and go out. None of us dream in necessarily always a linear, logical timeline. If you dream something tonight, you're not necessarily dreaming about what happened after what you dreamt last night. Right? Kind of moves in, moves out. Apocalyptic literature was not meant to be read in that way. Some people like to impose a linear timeline by chapter order. It doesn't work. If that's true, then the end of time comes over and over and over and over. Right? How many times can the stars fall from the heavens? Right? So it's not always in order. There's high symbolism. It's representative. It's meant to represent something, to mean something, to communicate something. You should not take the descriptions of the strange creatures or the events in the Revelation as this is what you're going to see. Right? So, for instance, all the people who like to talk about, well, there was a picture of a bear, and you know, the USSR used a lot of imagery of the bear, and so that must have been what he was foreseeing. And there's talk about an eagle flying in, and we know that's the national bird of the U.S., and so that must have been what he was foreseeing. No, it's supposed to communicate things to us. When we read about the lion, when we read about the lamb, we look back in the Bible and we say, oh, that's what these things represent. That's what it's meant to communicate to us. I heard one teacher in his series on the Revelation, he said we should not expect these images to come off the page and force them to walk. Meaning when you read about somebody with eyes in front and eyes behind, and it's not a literal thing. It's supposed to communicate something to you. So sometimes the symbolism is fluid, sometimes it's stacked. Another aspect of apocalyptic prophecy, angelic hosts and guides. That was a common trait of apocalyptic literature. You expected some sort of angel or heavenly being to guide you through and to give you instruction. We find that recurring in the Revelation. Presents a divine perspective. So even though John is writing about and preparing the early church for what's going to happen to them and the things that are going to continue to happen throughout time, sometimes we read that from a heavenly perspective. And there is eschatological dualism, in the ending of all things, right? So, remembering this really helps us to rightly read and interpret the Revelation. If you try to force it to be literal or literalistic is the more correct term, you're going to misunderstand what it's trying to say. All right. Parallelism and recapitulation. Who wants to define that?
The retelling of the same.
Yes. Did you read that? Or did you just have an awesome definition right on your head?
Well, that's the notes I took before.
That is an awesome note that you took before. All right. I think I told you before. If I didn't, I'll tell you now. There was a guy on a college campus, and they were handing out, one of the local churches was handing out the little pocket New Testaments, right, as the freshman class come in. And the one kid who was completely unchurched, he'd never had a Bible before, and so he got one of these pocket New Testaments, and a couple months down the line, he met back, just happened to bump into the guy who gave it to him, and so he said, "Hey, did you read the Bible that I gave you?" And he said, "Yeah." So I really like that sci-fi stuff at the ending, but it just seemed to be pretty repetitive at the beginning. Right? Why did he say that? Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Essentially the same story. Right? It's intentionally repetitive. But not all the same detail. We don't have 100% of the same events in all four Gospels. Not even in all three. Matthew, Mark, and Luke were the closest together. So we're seeing different aspects, different features. And the same is true in the Revelation. When I say that there are 7 progressive recapitulations, we've also called them 7 vision sequences. All right? Each of these 7 can be taken on its own, but much like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they're going to be telling about the same time period, just different events, different details, different perspective. I do call them progressive because we get more detail as we go on. We get more about the ending as we go through these sequences. But when people say, no, you're saying in chapter 5 we're talking about the same thing again that we were talking about, earlier? Yeah, we are. Or rather, later on, that's one of the first ones. It's recapitulation. We're going over the same things again. Each of these 7 sequences tells us something about the time from Christ's first coming to His second coming. Right? All 7 of them. So there are many parallels. That's one reason, by the way, I said we could have this faster pace through the second half of the book. Because we've already laid the groundwork. Specifically all this introductory material so we know how to read it. And we're going to apply the same principles going forward. And we've already seen some of this stuff. So when we start talking about, for instance, 7 bowls, 7 plagues, we're going to think back to like 7 trumpets, right? It's going to be very much the same. There's going to be a lot of parallels between them. I mentioned a number of the themes that we will see that help us if we keep a lookout for these. Who'd like to say something about the prevalence of numbers in the Revelation? Well, first off, let me ask this. When you come to any number, and I'm not talking about the chapter or verse divisions, but in the text itself, when you come to any number in the Revelation, your first thought should be, what does it really mean? Because almost all these numbers are symbolically significant. For instance, what's probably the most prominent symbolic number? 7. We got 7 divisions. Some of those are nested 7s. Within one of the 7 divisions, we have 7 of stuff under there or in there, right? 7 being the completeness. There were 7 churches of Asia. It's not that there was not 8 churches that existed. Actually, there were many more. There's a reason there was 7, representing the completion. Numbers like 12, right? Unity from diversity. There were 12 tribes, 12 apostles. We see that continuing on. Who can think of one of the other significant numbers?
1,000.
1,000. We use that 1,000, certainly in chapter 20, 1,000-year reign, also important, right? But there's also other mentioning of thousands. In fact, there's 7,000s, there's 12,000s, there's 144,000s. Whenever we see 1,000 in the Revelation, what should we think?
Large number.
Yeah, a whole bunch of them. Because they mostly couldn't count actually to 1,000, but they didn't really have any need to. They didn't deal with those large numbers the way we do, right? But anyways, it was symbolically meaning a lot. All right. How about Old Testament allusions? This is a big help to us. I told you at the beginning, one of the reasons people get the Revelation wrong, one of the reasons people get the New Testament wrong is because we don't know the Old Testament the way we should. Most of these strange figures, right, like 4 living creatures, at the very end we'll see the tree of life. Where do we get the tree of life? Where does that start? Back in Genesis, right? The 4 living creatures, that's from the prophets. All these strange, right, pictures, angels with 6 wings. Where do we get that from? That's Isaiah. So almost all of these strange pictures that, people want to turn into Apache helicopters or whatever. The first audience who would have received this in the first century, they knew their Jewish scriptures more than we, and so they would have picked up on these references very well. Divinity of Jesus, very important of the day. When the government was oppressing them to confess that Caesar is Lord, the Christians rose up and said, Jesus is Lord, right? There's a dual persecution, Jesus' close connection with his people. We see that one great instance that we're familiar with, when Paul is on the road to Damascus as a part of his great conversion experience. He sees the living Christ who says, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou my church, right? No, he said, why do you persecute me? When the church of Christ is persecuted, Christ himself is persecuted. He identifies with us. And so we see it described from both ways. Tale of Two Cities, classic novel. I used it here because there are 2 great cities compared and contrasted. One is Babylon, one is the New Jerusalem. Yep. So when we read about Babylon, just flag that in your mind. And when we read about the New Jerusalem, flag that and know that these 2 are compared and contrasted. That's part of the literary theme. There's calls for wisdom. This falls into sort of wisdom literature motif sometimes. What about Joshua? Why do I have Joshua on the list? Anybody remember? This also has to do with knowing our Old Testament. Although you do know this section. Yeah. That's right, which is much better than saying Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho, because he didn't do much fighting. All right? The name Jesus and Joshua, very closely related, essentially the same. Joshua, one of the big characters for the Jewish people as a leader in what God was doing. Jesus is the new and greater Joshua. And then John's Gospel, as I said, we'll see some of the terms and phrases that John uses outside of the Revelation. It helps us. All right, questions, comments about the themes? I know this is way high level from what we did before, and some of you might have been thinking we should have gone this fast the first time. Some of you are thinking this is too fast, I don't know. But the point is just to stir up what we've already covered in detail. All right, now let's talk about the epistolary purpose. Those of you who were here before may remember this graphic. If you don't, if you're familiar with Microsoft Outlook, this is an email. This is a composed email. And so I offer this as my picture of how we are to understand the way that the book of the Revelation is written. All right? So, on the 2 line, This is probably too small print for maybe the folks in the back to see. But up here you would see that this is sent to a distribution list called the churches. Right? To whom was the revelation originally sent? Specifically addressed to 7 of them, but it circulated around the churches. So, for whom was the book written in the immediate context, the immediate audience? For the churches. Now, I'm here to say it's just as applicable for us today, because it's God-breathed, because God works in these ways to write things that were speaking of their circumstance but applying to us. All right, the subject. I put a summarized subject here. It says, keep holding on, Jesus is coming. All right? When you type an email today, it is very helpful. By the way, if any of you have the bad habit of sending emails with no subject line or one that is not really relevant, don't do that. For people who get like 100 email a day, we need those subject lines to try to prioritize, right? So, if John were to write a subject line as he's sending out the revelation, it would have been something like, keep holding on, Jesus is coming. Right? Now, I took some of the text from the opening of the book and some of the text from the end of the book, and I put it in the body. So, envisioning this as an email going out. The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants. That's exactly what I read to you from chapter 1. Right? He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Parentheses, see attachments. I'm hoping this is helpful. And so pictured up here on the attachment line, I have, guess how many attachments? 7. And I have them titled as each of the 7 vision sequences. And then from the end of the book, God's angel said to me, these words are trustworthy and true, and the Lord, the God of the spirits of the prophets, has sent his angel to show his servants what must soon take place. And I continue on the end of the book. My point being, this is how we should understand the book of the Revelation. You read the opening of the first chapter, and it's the introductory to a letter or an email. You read the end of the last chapter, and it's the closing comments. The signature line says, your brother and partner in the tribulation and the kingdom and the patient endurance that are in Jesus, John. That's quotation from his letter. The 7 vision sequences are the attachments. In other words, the purpose of this document was to inform and to encourage, especially the immediate early church, because they were about to endure hard times. So God spoke to them so that they would understand what's going on and why it's going on. Those are the attachments. So you can take them individually, and you can. And we've been not only sequentially dealing with them, but dealing with them as sort of encapsulated sections, one sequence at a time. But they all, 7, serve the same purpose, to communicate this message. That the Lord is still on the throne. That the Lord Jesus is moving amongst his churches. He knows what's going on, positively and negatively. You remember the letters to the 7 churches? He noticed those who were faithful. He mentioned that. He noticed those who were not. And there were certain warnings. Right? So all of these vision sequences serve to promote, to bolster the case, to illustrate, to explain this message. Why should we be encouraged? Because everything that's going on, God is either sending directly or allowing to happen. Why is the world the way it is? I think one of the questions we had in one of the last few sessions was, how closely can we or should we tie the revelation and its message to headlines? I said, on the one hand, not at all. Because there are people who say, okay, the next thing that comes out on CNN, all right, let me tie that to a chapter and verse. Oh, that must be this. No. On the other hand, this is how we're supposed to understand our world. Right? How is it possible that things have gone so topsy-turvy in our nation? This book has the answer. Judgments of God are being poured out on a sinful world. The clock is winding down to the second coming of Christ. All these things have been prophesied and are now coming fulfilled. Now, it was true in the first century, but it's still true today. So I think this is a helpful lens through which to understand the book of the Revelation, the way it's structured and how we should read it. Right? So don't just jump in the middle, find some weird picture and go, wow, there's no way I could understand. I mean, my goodness, with eyes in the front and eyes in the back. I mean, what could that mean? No. It's a structure. And once you use the tools, it's easy to understand. Easier to understand. With God's help and illumination. All right, so sum all that up. 3 main keys to interpretation. Number 1, genre. Which means what kind of literature it is. And this is apocalyptic prophecy. Key number 2, source material, such as the Old Testament, such as John's other writings. Key 3, the epistolary purpose to the churches. I'll give you a moment to finish writing that because I think I just left those blanks with the images. And then we're going to put these to the test. All right. How to use the keys of interpretation. I'm just going to give some examples. Some of them perhaps ridiculous. Although honestly, you can't go more ridiculous than some of the things that I've read that were allegedly sincere interpretations of the book. Anyways, all right. So, if someone comes to you and says, we have to take these in chronological order. Chapter 20 is way past the events of chapter 5. Which of these 3 keys might help you to answer that? Because that seems very convincing if you don't know better. I mean, 20 is much after 5.
Source material?
Hmm?
Is it source material?
It could, if you're talking about the individual things. I would lean more towards genre. Because just knowing that it's apocalyptic literature means it's not necessarily meant to be read in chronological order. Right? We might go back, do a little recapitulation. We may just start over and talk about it from a different perspective. That's just the way it is. Or we may just lay some things out to show what they're about and be less concerned with this happened after that. Because that's the way apocalyptic literature went. Let's do another one. How about how about the people who would say, for instance, one of our last segments, coming near the end of sequence number 3, we read about smoke that comes from the abyss that was opened, and then there's locusts. You remember that? And so those people who say they're waiting for the judgment of God to come down when monster locusts, literally 6-foot bugs, will come across the earth. And we have predicted in there exactly what fraction of the earth that they will hit, because it talks about 2/3 of this and 2/3 of that. Which of these keys? I'd go back to genre. These are not foreseen events. These are symbolic things. All right, let's get off of genre. Let's talk about something else. Okay. What about the person who comes to the 7 trumpets and says, I'm real sure that this is a message from God about that demonic rock music? Right? I mean, look at the way that they're blowing these trumpets and bad things happen. We hear the loudspeakers. What have they missed? I mean, other than they're really hung up on style of music. Which of these keys will help us with that? Source material. Because we know that the famous Battle of Jericho was won by the 7 trumpets carried by the 7 priests. And that should just stick out to us, right? When the people talk about why is the lion a lamb, and they start going off on the lion is the symbol of this nation, and no. Source material. The Lion of the tribe of Judah. Right? Time and time again. How many lambs were slaughtered in the Old Testament? Source material. Right? Alright, epistolary purpose. Let's do this one. Well, I've already told you the answer. Alright, let's give an example. So, I think I read for you the one guy who was writing about, again, the locusts and all that. And John was viewing, by help of the Holy Spirit, literally Apache helicopters coming across the European front to suppress, right? No. To whom was this sent? Which ones? The 21st century churches? No, it's applicable to us, yeah. Is it to us today? Yeah. But who was it sent to? First century churches. Anybody who comes along and says, these are envisionings of 20th and 21st century events, wholly, across the board. So God inspired John to write this thing and give it to people with the understanding that they would have no clue what it was about for a few thousand years. No. That's crazy. That's why I say these are 3 of the most helpful keys. If we keep these things in mind, we can weed out a whole lot of misunderstanding and inconsistency. Okay? Just a caveat to that. I did say the Revelation does point to the last day. That hasn't happened yet. Yes. But there's a difference in looking to the end and the body of work being about Turks, helicopters, go on and on and on. Right? No. It has to have application to the first church as well as us today, or we've missed it. All right, so let's look through this. I think I have these written out for you. The first sequence, the 7 churches, beginning the first chapter, the vision of the Son of Man, the letters to them, talking about how that Jesus is Lord of all, encouraging them. How that He is moving among His churches. Remember the vision of the Son of Man walking among the candlesticks? We can never feel alone. Remember that the faithful will be strengthened and rewarded. The unfaithful will be judged by their works. And just underline at the ending of that sequence, Jesus is coming soon. Right? The historic Orthodox Christian Church has always held to the imminent return of Christ. We don't know when. But we're not waiting for the UN to make a motion and no. Jesus is coming soon. Be ready. Second sequence, the 7 seals, opens up with a vision of God's throne room. We see the majesty and holiness of God. We are provided a heavenly perspective on the tribulation of our age. In the first sequence, we read about these churches, depicting the state of churches and the errors and the follies that they fall into. Second sequence, we look from heaven down rather than from earth up. The earth is judged and God's people are saved. How all this flows from Jesus' conquering by His atoning death on Calvary. Believers gain insight to the whys of our time and encouragement in the purpose of our suffering, as well as confidence in the promised final salvation. The sequence ends by introducing the next sequence of trumpets, picturing the final judgment, all proceeding from the throne room. Right? Which is very much like in my Sunday school class this morning. We were asking the question, who killed Jesus? Who put Him to death? And so one of the kids very early said, the Romans. I said, that's true. There was Roman soldiers that nailed him there. There's also the Jews that put him and said, crucify him. But the Bible says that God put his son to death. Right? Needed to be. That doesn't lessen the guilt of the people, but God planned it. So when we look at the calamities of our day, and we look at the judgments being poured out, it's because of sin and sinfulness, and we can't take guilt away from people, but God is pouring these judgments out upon the earth. All right? That's the biblical worldview. So all these judgments proceed from the throne room. Third sequence, the 7 trumpets. 7th trumpet blast takes us all the way to the end, completing the sequence and the timeline. The Song of the Elders summarizes the sequence and provides the punctuation of consummation of the kingdom. Right? It's winding down, which means destruction of this earth, but it also means consummation of the kingdom. That means all things will be set right. It means justice and peace, all tears wiped away. All those things we look forward to, that is coming. And it concludes with the typical language of judgment, lightning, thunder, and hail, depicting the day of judgment. Anybody want to throw out some other times in the Scripture where we see lightning and thunder, hail? A lot in the prophets. We also see it, for instance, the cross of Christ, right? Darkness, earthquake. We see it at other times whenever God moves. When God is spoke about this morning, Mount Sinai. Why were the people afraid to come to the mountain? Because it was clear God was there. All right, so those are very quick summaries of the first 3 sequences. Up next is the 4th sequence, which I have tongue-in-cheek titled 3 Monsters and a Baby, chapters 12 through 14. Following that, the 7 plagues or 7 bowls, chapters 15 and 16. The fall of Babylon in 17 through 19. And then the final sequence, the millennium and Satan's defeat, 20, 21, 22. That's what we have to look forward to. Good stuff. All right. Looking ahead. We're halfway through. And by time period, the longer half, if you will. Because we're going to apply what we already know to each of these. You're already experienced interpreters of the revelation. In these next lessons, I expect to just read it and go, what does this mean? You're going to answer, and I'm just going to go right forward. No, we'll do it a little different than that. All right. But we will continue to use the same methods, the same tools. We're going to use those 3 keys. We're going to talk about, this sounds like something we've dealt with before, right? We're going to look back at our notes. We're going to understand it. Do plan to finish in 2016. That was my target when I first started it last year. And the very next lesson, by popular demand, before we get into the next sequence proper, I will provide the case for the timing of the war in heaven or Satan's being cast out being in the time of the Gospels. So that's what to look forward to next Sunday night. It had kind of come up a couple times before, and it's going to be dealt with in this next session, so I'm just going to devote one night to that. And then when we get to it, it won't be strange. You had a question or comment?
I do.
Okay.
The book of Revelation.
Yes.
As they read,
Yes.
given out to churches.
Yes, sir.
At the time, churches were being persecuted. They didn't know what tomorrow was going to bring. They didn't know what the future held for them.
Some of them were already very much into that. Some of them were just getting into it. Yes.
And so this comes to them and should give them great encouragement because they can kind of see
Yes.
where they fall into kind of what's going on.
Yes.
And to them it was extremely important. And so I think then that we as God's people fail because the church is now 2,000 years older and we've come through all kinds of persecutions and here we are today at this point. And our people, we don't know anything about Revelation because our leaders and our preachers have not preached that. There's not scripture hardly in Revelation that I can show you. But you go to all the other,
And that's a terrible thing.
you go to all the other books, and, everybody's got their favorite scripture, but I bet very few of them are out of Revelation. So So somewhere along the line, I think we've dropped the ball.
We absolutely have dropped the ball. And one of the things, apart from just making this book accessible to you, one of the things this study has allowed me to do, if this makes any sense at all, I can now preach more freely from these texts. Right? If I would have just started preaching Revelation texts without ever going over any of this, and no telling how many different, I've never heard this before, or I heard it this way and I heard it that way, I mean, that's problematic. It's hard to apply scriptures that you're unfamiliar with, and we're very unfamiliar with them. I remember several years ago, Sash and I were having a discussion. We had, I don't know, a couple kids, 3, sometime in the early days when there weren't so many kids. And we were talking about, like, is it a wise thing for Christians to have children with concerns about, like, what the world's becoming? Right? And I think that's probably the mindset that a lot of our people are in. And in part because we've neglected this book and other texts as well. I recently read the biography of a man who lived and pastored in Germany in World War II. In fact, he was put to death for his participation in a plot, planning a plot at least, to kill Hitler. Right? If you want to talk about Christians who understood how bad it's getting in persecution, they did. Because it wasn't just Jews, it was Christians being put. And I remember how much it impacted me when, while he was already not only under suspicion, but I believe he was already imprisoned when he became engaged. And they were making plans to be married, and they were being asked how and why you could do that. And his response was, because we're God's children and we know He's going to take care of us. And it just blew me away. He's in prison for standing against the evil regime and for preaching the gospel. Those were kind of the same for him. And he's talking about, no, I want to make plans for a wedding. Now, he never got to marry her. But his outlook was not, oh, we should just go into caves right now because it's about to get bleak. His outlook was, the scriptures say God's in control. We should live out the Christian life. Wisely, but we should live out with the expectation of God's salvation. And it just struck me how, man, I've never heard that from anybody in my life. All I've ever heard the preacher say was, it's getting dark and it's only going to get darker. Buckle up. You know, I just don't think that's right. So, mini sermon, forgive me.
Well, I just don't think we get out of it what the early Christians
No.
at all.
It would help if we looked at it once in a while to get something out of it.
Well, it's got so true now. I mean, it's man, you can, and I have, even from our own preachers, you can't find just one, not just preachers, but you can't just find one opinion. You know, it's just, I remember before I was saved, what's the guy's name that back whenever it was years and years ago that they could see the future, or what was his name?
Oh, Nostradamus.
Nostradamus. And I heard one of our preachers tied Nostradamus Revelation. I mean, him interpreting Revelation, you know, and I mean, it is. I stood up one time and we had Sunday school lesson. I didn't say long, but something was said, and I said something, and man, I got pretty much my butt chewed out, you know, right there. So I mean, it's understandable that people shy away from it. I mean, especially the younger people, because you've not heard just one idea. I mean, I've never heard it put the way you put it the last few months. I can remember going to West End and listening to Brother Russell do the whole Revelation. And man, I enjoyed it. It wasn't nothing like this. I mean, it was tied to the Catholic Church, and it was tied to this and this and this.
And nothing in the East, right? Only the West. Nothing against him. That's just, that's...
No, I mean, that's just the way it was.
Yeah. It's become a closed book to us for more than a generation. And it's not just us. I mean, It's not like, oh, all the rest of the people have been holding on to this, and the missionary Baptist people have been closed. Right? There's very few in larger Christendom, right? Because this is not the way. You don't fill up conferences and sell books and T-shirts and everything presenting it this way. There is a way that you can fill up conferences and sell books and make movies and all the rest, and it's been done and it's continuing to be done, but it's not faithful to the text.
And we as people kind of clamp down. I mean, we close our minds to, it gets too deep, I'm done, you know, or whatever, you know. I can understand why we've gotten so far away from it and allowed it to intimidate us the way that it has, you know.
It's not an easy book, but it doesn't need to be closed to us.
No, I mean, like I try to tell people, but especially my in-laws, I can't take everything by word and it's figurative. I remember getting into a conversation with my mother-in-law and something came up about mansions in heaven. Why do you think we need a mansion in heaven? Are you expecting it to rain? What do you want your kitchen to look like in your mansion? It's figurative. I mean, it's not.
Yes. Yes.
You ought to have a great place to live the rest of your eternity. You know, you don't need a house. There's no reason to have a house in heaven. And it's just, you know, people just, they hold on to a lot of things and let it go.
In the Middle Ages, it said that many of the common folk got their theology from looking at stained glass. So whatever that picture, they took that as, they interpreted it however they did, because they didn't get much good solid preaching or teaching, right? Well, we don't maybe have the stained glass, but we've done the same thing. Good comments, good questions. Hope that wasn't too fast, but I hope it did jog your memory a little bit and get you back in gear for starting next week. Anything else? If not, I'll close down the recording.